Chapter 6 of the Adventures of a Suburbanite. This is a Librivox Recording. All Librivox Recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Natalie Paula. The Adventures of a Suburbanite by Ellis Parker Butler. Chapter 6 The Speckled Hen. In order to relieve the reader's suspense, I may as well say here that Jimmy Dunn did not marry Miss Seeler. It is too bad to sacrifice what promised to be a first-class love interest, but the truth is that there is less chance of Jimmy ever marrying Miss Seeler than there seemed the likelihood of Isabel and me reaching Port Lafayette in Mr. Millington's automobile. Usually when we started for Port Lafayette, my wife and Millington's wife would dress for the matinee or church or wherever they intended on going that day, and when Millington heard the knocking sound in his engine and began to get out his tools, they would excuse themselves politely and go to spend the day in the city. They usually returned in time to get into the car and ride back to the garage. But I stuck to Millington. You can never tell when a car of that kind will be ready to start up, and I was really very anxious to go to Port Lafayette. I spent some very delightful days with Millington that way, for when he was mending his car he was always in charming humour, and as gay and playful as a kitten. I began to fear that one, if not the only, reason why Mr. Millington was always in such a good humour when his car wasn't a bad one, was because I told him that I had heard of a man in Port Lafayette who had a fine farm of white Wyandotte chickens, and that I thought I might buy some for my place. Millington does not believe in Wyandottes. He is all for Orpingtons. It is remarkable how many wives object to chickens. I do not blame Isabel for not liking chickens, for she was born in a flat, and I am willing to make allowances for her lack of education. But why Mrs. Rolfs and Mrs. Millington should dislike chickens was beyond my comprehension. Both were born in the suburbs and grew up in a real chickenish atmosphere, and still they do not keep chickens. I must say, however, that Mr. Rolfs and Mr. Millington are persons of greater intelligence. Almost the first day I moved into the suburb of Westcote, Mr. Rolfs leaned over the division fence and complimented me on my foresight in purchasing such an admirable place on which to raise chickens. He told me that if I needed any advice about chickens he would be glad to supply me with all I wished, just as a neighbourly matter. He seemed to take it as a matter of course that I would arrange for a lot of chickens as soon as I was fairly settled on the place, and in this he was seconded by Mr. Millington. When Mr. Millington saw Mr. Rolfs talking to me he came right over and said that, while he hated to boast, he studied chickens from A to Gizzard, and when I was ready to get my chickens he could give me some suggestions that would be simply invaluable. We talked the chicken matter over very thoroughly, and I soon saw that they were men of knowledge and deep experience in chicken matters. When they decided that I should keep chickens, and what kind of chickens, and where I should build a coop, and what kind of coop I should build, we all shook hands warmly, and I went around the front to tell Isabel I was very enthusiastic about chickens when I went. After I had interviewed Isabel for 3 minutes, I learned definitely that I was not going to keep chickens. There were a great many things Mr. Rolfs and Mr. Millington had not said about chickens, and those were the very things Isabel told me, and they were all reasons for not having chickens on the place at all. She also threw in an opinion of Mr. Rolfs and Mr. Millington. It seemed that they were the two villains of the most depraved sort, who would not dare keep chickens themselves because they were afraid of their wives, and who were trying to steal a vicarious joy by bossing my chickens when I got them, but that I was not going to get any, absolutely. Of course I always do what Isabel tells me, and when she told me I was not going to have chickens I obeyed. But I merely told Mr. Rolfs and Mr. Millington when they came over the next day that I had been thinking the matter over, and that I was doubtful whether the south corner or the north corner would be the best place for the coop. So we three went and looked over the ground again. Both favoured the north corner, so I hung back and seemed undecided and doubtful. Finally, in a week or two, they agreed with me. I never saw two men so anxious to have a neighbour keep chickens. They were willing to let me have almost everything my own way. It was quite a strain on me, for I had to think of new objections to their plans every day or so, but I could see the suspense was harder on Mr. Rolfs and Mr. Millington. Every morning they came and hung over my fence wistfully, and every evening they came over and talked chickens, and on the train to town they spoke freely of the chickens that they were going to keep. In a month they were talking of the chickens they were keeping and bragging about them, and old seasoned chicken raisers used to hunt them up and sit with them and ask them information on knotty points. Toward fall, Mr. Rolfs and Mr. Millington were beginning to talk about the large sums of money they were making out of their chickens, and promising settings of their white Orpington and white Wyandotte eggs to the commuters, and they began to be really annoying. They would stand at the fence, hollow-eyed and hungry looking, staring into my yard, and when I passed they would make slighting remarks about me and the lack of my decision in my character. They said sneeringly that they did not believe I would ever get any chickens. "You, Millington, and you, Rolfs," I said firmly, "should remember one thing. I am the man who is getting these chickens, and the main thing in raising chickens is to start right. I do not want to go into this thing hastily and regret it all my life. If you do not like my way, all you have to do is build coops yourself and buy chickens and raise them yourselves. Be patient. Every day I am learning more about chickens from your conversations on the train, and when I do get my chickens you will find I have profited by your suggestions." Millington and Rolfs had to be satisfied with that, so far as I was concerned, for although I spoke to Isobel frequently on the subject of chickens, she had not changed. I silenced Millington by telling him that I would have chickens long before he ever succeeded in taking Isobel and me to Port Lafayette in his automobile. "If that's all you're waiting for," he said, "we'll start to morrow." And so we did, but that was all. Millington and Rolfs during the winter worked off some of their surplus chicken energy writing letters to the poultry periodicals. My friends in town began asking me why I did not keep chickens when I lived near to such chicken experts as Rolfs and Millington, by whose experience I could profit. But the worst came one day on the train when Rolfs actually had the assurance to offer me a setting of his white Wyandotte eggs. I blame Rolfs and Millington for acting in this way. No man should brag about chickens he has not. I only bragged about those I meant to get. "I wish you would hurry a bit in getting those chickens of mine," Millington would say. "I ought to have at least 10 hens sitting by this time." And then Rolfs would say, "He's right about that. Unless you get my white Wyandotte soon, the chicks will not be hatched before the cold weather. I ought to have the hens on the eggs now." Occasionally I mentioned chickens in an offhand way to Isobel, but she had not changed her views. "Now, Isobel," I would say, "about chickens." At the word chickens, Isobel would look at me reproachfully, and I would end meekly. "About chickens," I was saying, "don't you think we could have a pair of broilers to morrow?" As a matter of fact, this happened so often I began to hate the sight of broiled chicken, and I was forced to mention roast chicken once in a while. It was after one of these times that the event happened that stirred all Westcote. I had reached a point where I dodged Mr. Rolfs and Mr. Millington when I saw them, in order to avoid their insistent clamour for chickens, when one evening Isobel met me at the door with a smile. "John," she cried, "what do you think? Our chicken laid an egg." "Chicken?" I asked anxiously. "Did you say chicken?" "And I'm going to give you the egg for dinner," cried Isobel joyfully. "Just think, John, our own egg laid by our own chicken. Do you want it fried or boiled or scrambled?" "Isobel," I demanded, "what is the meaning of all this?" "I just could not kill the hen," Isobel ran on, "after it had been so friendly. I felt as if I could be killing one of the family." "People do get to feeling that way about chickens when they keep them," I said insinuatingly. "Why, Isobel, I have known wives to love chickens so warmly, wives that never cared a snap for chickens before, wives that hated chickens, and they grew to love chickens so well that as soon as the coop was made, of course it was nice, clean, airy coop, Isobel, and the dear little fluffy chicks began to peep about." Isobel stiffened. "John," she said finally, "you are not going to keep chickens." "Certainly not," I agreed hastily. "But of course we can't kill Spotty," said Isobel. "I'll call her Spotty because that seems such a perfect name for her. I telephoned for a roaster this morning because you suggested having a roaster for dinner, John, and when the roaster came it was a live chicken. Imagine!" "Horrors!" I exclaimed. "I should think so," agreed Isobel. So there was nothing to do but phone the grocer to come and get the live rooster, but when I phoned his grandmother was much worse, and the store was closed until she got better, or worse, and I couldn't bear to see the poor thing in the basket with his legs tied all that time, for there is no telling how long an old person like a grandmother will remain in the same condition. So I loosened the roaster in the cellar, and at 4:15 I heard it cluck. It laid an egg. I knew that the moment I heard it cluck. "Isobel," I said, "you were born to be the wife of a chicken fancier. You shall eat that egg." "No, John," she said, "you shall eat it. It's our first real egg, laid by our dear little Spotty, and you shall eat." "No, Isobel," I began, and then, as I saw how determined she was, I compromised. "Let us have the egg scrambled," I said, "and each of us eat a part." "Very well," said Isobel, "if you will promise not to kill Spotty, we'll keep her for ever and ever." I agreed, and Isobel kissed me for that. After we had eaten the egg, and both Isobel and I agreed that it was really a superior egg, we went down to the cellar and looked at Spotty. I would say she was a very intelligent looking hen, but homely. There was nothing flashy about her. She was the kind of hen a man might enter in the sweepstakes class and not get a prize, and then enter in the consolation class and not get a prize, and then enter for the booby prize and still be outclassed, and then enter in the plain old barnyard fowl class and not get within 10 miles of a prize, and then be taken to the butcher as a boarding house broiler and be refused on account of age, tough looks, and emaciation. She was no pampered darling of the hen house, but a plain old survival of the fittest squawker, the kind of hen that along about the 1st of May begins clucking in a vexed tone of voice, flies over the top of the 2-story bam, and wanders off somewhere into the tall grass back of the cow pasture, to appear some weeks later with 12 chicks of 12 assorted patterns, ranging from Shanghai bantam to plain yellow nondescript. She was a good durable hen of the old school, with a wary startled eye and an extra loud squawk, and the brain the size of a grain of salt. Spotty was the sort of hen that could go right along day after day without steam heat or elevators in her coop, and manage to make a living. As soon as I saw her my heart swelled with pride, for I knew I had secured a very rare variety of hen. Since every man that can tell a chicken from an ostrich, and some that can't, has become a chicken fancier, the aristocratic raised by hand pedigree fowl has become as common as dirt, and it is indeed difficult to secure a genuine mongrel hen. I was elated, as nearly as I could judge by first appearances. I was the owner of one of the most mongrel hens that ever laid a plain omelette quality egg. When I made a coop by nailing a few slats across the front of a soap box, and had nailed Spotty in, I took the coop under my arm and went to the back yard. Mr. Millington was there, and Mr. Rolfs was there, and they were arguing angrily about the respective merits of white Wyandottes and white Orpingtons. But when they saw me they uttered 2 loud cries of joy and ran to meet me. I tried to cling to the coop, but they wrested it from me, and together carried it in triumph to the north corner and set it on the grass. Mr. Millington pulled his compass from his pocket and set the coop exactly as advised by the Complete Poultry Guide, with the bars facing the morning sun, and Rolfs hurried to the back lot and hunted up a piece of bone, which he crushed with a brick and placed in the coop as advised by the gentleman poultry fancier. He told us that a supply of bone was most necessary if he expected his hen to lay eggs, and that he knew this hen of his was going to be a great layer. He said he had given the egg question years of study, and that he could tell a good layer when he saw one. Millington told me his coop was not as he had meant it to be, but said it would do until he could get one built according to scientific poultry principles. He pointed out that the poultry coop should be heated by steam, and showed me that there was no room in the soap box for a steam heating plant. He said he would not trust his flock of chickens through the winter unless there was steam heating installed. Then Rolfs and Millington said they guessed the first thing to do, as it was late in the season, was to set their hen immediately, and as it would probably take Spotty 13 days to lay enough eggs, they told me to run down to the delicatessen store and buy 13 eggs, while they arranged a scientific nest in the corner of their coop for sitting purposes. When I suggested that perhaps Spotty was not ready to set, they laughed at me. They said they could see I would never make a prosperous chicken farmer if I put off until tomorrow what the hen might do today. That a hen that ought to set and would not set must be made to set. Millington said he did not mind if Spotty wanted to lay. If she felt so, she could go ahead and lay while she was taking her little rests between sets. He said that in that way she would be doubly useful, and that, judging by appearances, she was the kind of hen who could do 2 or 3 things at the same time. Mr. Prawley, when he saw we were going to keep our hen, came out and spoke to Mr. Millington, Mr. Rolfs, and me. He said that he had an aversion to hens, that if I insisted he would devote some of his time to the hen. But Mr. Millington, Mr. Rolfs, and I assured him that we would not need his help. We felt that the 3 of us, with occasional aid from Isobel, could manage that hen. The next day Mr. Millington and Mr. Rolfs were so swelled with pride that they would not speak to me on the train. Millington did not ask me that entire day to take a little run up to Port Lafayette in his automobile. I heard him tell one man on the train to town that he had just set his 18 prize white Orpingtons, and I heard Rolfs tell another man at the same time about a coupe he had just had made for his white Wyandottes. He drew a sketch of it on the back of an envelope, showing the location of the heating plant, the location of the gasoline brooders, and the battery of 8 electric incubators. He said he saw but one mistake he had made, which was that he had had a gravel roof put on. It should have been slate. He was afraid the hens would fly up onto the roof and eat the gravel for digestive purposes, and if a lot of tarry gravel got in their craws and stuck together in a lump, his hens would suffer from indigestion. But he said he meant to have the gravel roof taken off at once, regardless of cost, but he had not quite decided on a slate roof. One of the slates might become loosened and fall and kill one of the prize white Wyandottes, which he had held at $75 each. If he could avoid the tar trouble, Rolfs said he ought to have 1,200 laying hens by the end of summer, besides the broilers he would sell. He said he was going straight to a distinguished chemist when he reached the town, to learn if there was any dissolvents that would dissolve tar in a chicken's craw without harming the craw. Then Millington drew a sketch of the automatic heat regulator he was having made to attach to his heating apparatus. He said that ever since he had been keeping poultry he had made a study of coop heating, and that the trouble with most coops was that they were either too hot or too cold. He said that a cold coop meant the chickens got chilly and exhausted, their vitality growing thick feathers when all their strength should have been used in egg laying, and that a hot coop meant the chickens felt lax and indolent. A hot coop enervated a chicken and made it too lazy to lay eggs, Millington said, but this regulator he was having made would keep the heat at an even temperature, summer and winter, and render the hens bright and cheerful and inclined to do their best. Millington explained that this was especially necessary with white Orpingtons, which are great eaters and consequently more inclined towards nervous dyspepsia, which makes a hen moody. He was going on in this way, and everyone was hanging on his words, when he happened to say that one thing he was always attended to most particularly was the state of his hens' teeth. He said he had, so far, avoided dyspepsia in his hens by keeping their teeth in good condition. Everyone knew poor teeth caused stomach troubles. That was the end of Millington. Rolfs had been green with jealousy because so many commuters were listening to Millington. At the moment Millington mentioned teeth, Rolfs sneered. "How many teeth do white Orpingtons have, Millington?" he asked. "I did not know they had any." Then Millington asked sneeringly how high his hens could fly, and Rolfs said they were in such good condition that they thought nothing of flying to the top of a 40-foot elm tree, and Millington sneered and said one could guess what kind of white Wyandottes Rolfs had, when a common white Wyandotte is so heavy it cannot fly over a rake handle. That was the end of Rolfs, and I was glad of it, for the two of them had been getting enough reputation on the strength of my chickens. They sneaked out of the smoking car, and at last I had a chance to say a few words, modestly of course, about my splendid group of 600 buff leghorns. I did not brag as Millington and Rolfs had bragged, but stated facts, coldly and calmly, and my words met the attention they deserved, for I was not speaking without knowledge, as Millington and Rolfs had spoken, but as a man who owns a hen can speak. I reached home that evening in a pleasant state of mind, for I knew how kind-hearted Isobel is, and I knew she would see, if I placed it before her, that it was extremely cruel to keep a hen in solitary confinement, when the hen had probably been accustomed to a great deal of society. I felt sure that in a few days Isobel would order me to purchase more poultry to allow Spotty to lead a pleasant and sociable life, but when Isobel met me at the gate she disheartened me. She said the grocer's grandmother had not been seriously ill, after all. She had been in a mere comatose condition, and had come to. And the grocer came back, and he called and had taken Spotty. He offered to kill her, Spotty, not Isobel or his grandmother, but Isobel would not bear to eat Spotty so soon after she had been a member of our family. So the grocer took Spotty away, and sent up another roaster. At least he said it was another, but after I carved it I had my doubts. In general strength and durability the roaster and Spotty were one. The next morning I went to see if Mr. Prawley had hoed the garden properly. I found Mr. Rolfs and Mr. Millington leaning over my fence. They were unabashed. "I have been looking over your place," said Rolfs. "I must say it is a most admirably located place on which to keep a cow. and if you want suggestions on cow keeping, you may call on me at any time. I have studied the cow in all her moods and tenses for years." "Nonsense," said Millington. "A man is foolish to try to keep live stock. Live stock is subject to all the ills " "Such as toothache?" sneered Rolfs. "All the ills of man and beast," continued Millington. "What you want is an automobile. Now, I'll sell mine." "No," I said positively. "You can only say that because you do not know my automobile as I know it," said Millington. "It's a wonder, that machine is. Now, I propose that to morrow you and your wife take a little run up to Port Lafayette with me and my wife, after the cares of chicken raising." "Very well, Millington," I said, "we will go to Port Lafayette." CHAPTER VII.